ASMR. Hey everybody. I thought today I would read some more of the ghostly encounters in the book True Tales of Ghostly Encounters, compiled and edited by Andrew Honigman from the Files of Fate magazine. The first encounter is called The Man in Black. When I was a teenager, we lived in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the last house on a court. The houses were all large and old, and no doubt many children have run and played in that court. One summer, in 1935 or 36, a storm was brewing. The sky was growing dark, and the huge oak trees that lined our court made it even darker there. My two sisters, Ruth and Phyllis, and several neighbor girls were playing a made-up game that consisted mostly of chasing each other back and forth to the end of the court, screaming a lot. I was a little old for such games, but that day I had lowered my dignity to join in the fun. A lightning crackled directly overhead, and thunder sounded almost instantly behind it. We decided we had time to make only one more dash to the end of the court before the rain came. We had run only a short way when we all came to a sudden halt. Directly in front of us, under the biggest oak tree, was a man dressed in all black. His wide-brimmed hat and ankle-length coat were from a long ago past. The wide brim of the hat shaded his face so we could not see his features. Seconds before, he had not been there, and we couldn't understand where he had come from. Yet there he was, arm and palm held outward as if to warn us to go back. And go back we did, racing and stumbling onto our front porch. We just had reached the front step when a bolt of lightning blazed downward, and with an ear-splitting crash, struck the pavement where we would have been at that moment if the man in black had not frightened us into racing home. The concussion felt like a hand slammed into my back. Screaming, we turned to see where the man in black was, but there was no man. Only the smell of sulfur hung in the air, and the rain came down in torrents. Our father, hearing the noise, came running out, and when we told him our story, he dashed to the end of the court to see if he could see the man in black. But there was no one anywhere in the street. Where the tall stranger came from and where he went, we'll never know. But we'll remember him. If it hadn't been for him, we would not be here today. That experience was from Barbara Carruthers from Coloma, Michigan, and she submitted the story in August of was a devastating time for my family. My son-in-law Robert had died in a scuba diving accident at the age of 30. My daughter Meryl was left to raise their son Daniel, who was only 5 months old at the time. It has taken years for her to recover from her grief. One evening in May of that year, I was knitting and watching one of my favorite TV programs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a slight movement. Glancing across the room, I saw Robert standing in the doorway, a huge grin on his face. I sat motionless, longing to turn off the TV, but frightened in case any movement would cause me to lose him. I smiled at him, and we had a conversation that took place in our heads. I didn't speak at all, but the communication was as clear as if we were talking. I told him how we all missed him, especially Meryl, and I asked him to please help her cope with her life now. As he had been an experienced diver, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had found nothing wrong with his diving gear, I asked him what had happened. He said it had been his own fault, as he had been careless. He then told me he had come to give me a message for my son Rob, who lives in Thailand. I was surprised, as the two young men had only met a few times. Robert stated quite clearly, "Tell Rob that if he doesn't change his life soon, he could end up with me in the near future." I wanted to ask Robert more questions, but he had gone. I turned off the TV and sat for a long time, marveling at what had happened. I didn't dare tell the family about Robert's visit, as it seemed so unbelievable. It was several years before I even broached the subject with Meryl, but when I did, she was not surprised. She feels his presence too, occasionally, and sees tiny flashes of blue lights when he is near. After a week of wrestling with my thoughts, I decided to phone my son and risk him thinking his mother had completely lost her mind. I knew Rob had recently started a new job that he really enjoyed. His life had sounded fine when I had last spoken to him. Rob was surprised to hear from me, as we had spoken only a few weeks before. I told him he must promise not to think me insane, and then I related the facts of his brother-in-law's visit. There was silence on the other end of the phone, long enough for me to ask if he was still there. When Rob finally spoke, he sounded shaken. He told me he had kept the details of his life from me, as he didn't want me to worry. Rob wanted to end a relationship with a girl he had dated for almost a year. He had tried several times in recent months to talk to her, but she told him she would commit suicide if he ever left her. She She was extremely possessive and questioned his every move. The situation had now worsened. Her father had threatened Rob with death if he deserted his daughter. My son felt his life was spinning out of control. I urged Rob to return to Canada immediately, but he said he would never forgive himself if his girlfriend carried on with a suicide threat. I told him she was just using that as a hold on him, and it was most unlikely she would go through with it once he had left. I was later proved to be right, as she apparently found another boyfriend soon after Rob left. Rob was back in Canada within days. He left Thailand at night and did not even dare tell his employer where he was going in case word got back to the irate father. Rob stayed with me for a month, and then he returned to Thailand, settling hundreds of miles from where he had lived previously. As the years go by, the memory of Robert's visit stays vividly in my memory. Today, my son is happily married and is the father of an 18-month-old daughter. I know we have Robert to thank for his happiness. This story was from Margaret Davies from Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada, August 2001. Unfinished business. Death is the ultimate interruption. The deadline of all deadlines. What is left undone at the time of passing is to the rational, common sense view beyond completion. Or is it? The following stories indicate that sometimes responsibility for one's loved ones and promises is strong enough to survive the transition. Departed spirits may return to mark significant anniversaries, to resolve conflicts before moving on, or to provide assistance to a person in need. Whatever the nature of the afterlife, these stories speak to an emotional connection between this life and the next. So these next few stories are going to be about unfinished business. Jimmy, is that you? In the summer of 1966, when I was 17, my 19-year-old cousin, James Kajawara, and I spent endless hours discussing our plans for the future. Then Jimmy was drafted into the Army. His eventual destination was Vietnam. Before leaving for advanced infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia, he gave me my Christmas, birthday, and graduation presents. Roy, he said, I have a feeling I won't be coming back. Don't say that, I pleaded. Promise me you'll be back for my graduation next June. Okay, I promise I'll be back. But 4 months later, on March 11th, 1967, he was killed in action. I tried to deny his death. At first I felt empty, then angry. Finally I felt nothing. inside me. The graduating students sat up on the hot bleachers of the Dennington High School gym, while the parents were seated on the main floor. Wiping the sweat off my face, I watched the setting sun cast an eerie light through the doors. Suddenly a chill swept through my whole body, as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water on my head. I began to shiver uncontrollably. I looked for Mom down in the audience, and then I saw him, standing in the doorway. Just 200 feet away was Jimmy. A wave of heat engulfed my body. Quickly, I looked away in fear. The student sitting next to me said, "What's the matter? Looks like you've seen a ghost." Though panic-stricken, I summoned my courage and looked at Jimmy again. He was wearing his favorite red Pendleton shirt, carrying his camera as usual, and smiling directly at me. "Do you see that guy standing over there at the door?" I asked my neighbor. "What guy? Are you all right?" he replied. But it wasn't a dream. All I could manage was to smile at Jimmy, and then he was gone. My heart sank. Who would ever believe me? Several days later, when I couldn't hold it inside any longer, I confided in Mom. "Tell me when and where you saw him," she said. "What did he look like?" Slowly, I repeated the details of my experience to her. "I thought it was a dream, but I know it wasn't." "It was no dream," Mom said, "because you're describing exactly what I saw too." I was relieved and stunned all at once. I had never had any feelings about life or death. Jimmy came back to show me the truth. This experience was sent in by Roy Matsuda in Larkspur, California, February 1986. Visiting grandparents. My ex-husband was a violent bully during our marriage, and after one particularly heavy beating, I crawled back to bed and just lay there. I knew that if my 3-year-old son wakened from his afternoon sleep, I would not be able to go to him. I was past crying and just asked his spirit and my departed father for help. Suddenly, very gently, someone sat on the bed, stroked my head, and held me in unseen arms. I fell asleep and awakened about 5 hours later, feeling a lot better. I heard my son laughing and went to him. As I entered the sitting room, he was waving goodbye to someone. Looking around, I saw that not only had he been entertained, but he had also been given snacks. obviously had a great afternoon. Somehow I knew I did not have to worry. I asked him who had been there, and he pointed to a photo of my parents. Gran and Grandpa had spent the afternoon with him, he said. They were always there for me when they were alive, and I know they are still there for us. That's from Pat Kennedy, Glasgow, Scotland, September 2000. Plea for forgiveness. We were living on a farm near Tulsa, Oklahoma, in July of 1921. The noise of the men and machinery in the process of baling blue stem hay came with a breeze through the open kitchen window, where shortly before 10 o'clock, I was busy cooking the noon meal for a crew of hungry men. My 3 children were in the adjoining room. As I worked, I thought about my mother in Indiana, who slowly was dying of cancer of the liver, until my husband David and I had moved west. We had all lived in the same house. Not a doting grandmother, my mother had made my life pretty miserable after the birth of each child. A hush fell over the place. I glanced through the window and saw the men standing around the water keg. I stepped to the door of the next room to see what my children were doing. I gasped. There, on my low rocker, sat my mother, with her arms around my children. Memory of her pain-ravaged face as it turned toward me still brings tears to my eyes. Her eyes were pleading silently for forgiveness and love. The vision was like a flash, gone in an instant, but as real as life. When my astonished eyes could focus again, I saw my oldest child lying on the floor reading, his feet propped in a chair. His sisters sat on the floor, dressing their dolls. They were unaware of the shock that I had received. I forgot to bake pie that day and was scolded for my negligence. I never did tell my husband of this experience. He would have laughed. But that pleading look in my mother's eyes meant more to me than pies. That same evening, a telegram came. It said, "Your mother died this morning at 10 minutes of 10 o'clock. That experience comes from Ellen Blazier of Claremore, Oklahoma, December 1964. Wow, that was a powerful one. What had he left behind? When I was a child, my grandfather, John Colson, lived with us in our home in Erin, New York. He was bedridden and finally died in the spring of 1949. During his lengthy illness, he used to holler hello whenever he wanted anything. As his condition became worse, the frequency of his calls increased, and whoever was nearby would tend to his needs. After he died, we continued to hear his voice and his familiar call of "hello." Everyone in the house heard it. We searched the house many times to find any unusual sound that might be misinterpreted as his voice, but we found nothing. My mother insisted that it was a trick of memory, but we children were convinced it was grandfather's ghost. The climax came Christmas Eve, 1949, when the adults all were out of the house. My cousin, my brother and sister, our dog, and I were home alone. Our German Shepherd was a bit too friendly to excel as a watchdog, but nevertheless, she always raised an alarm if strangers were near the house at night. We all heard the first noise from grandfather's room. The dog bristled, then whined as she took refuge behind the davenport. Her unusual behavior scared us more than the original noise. It sounded as if someone were searching frantically through the room. Drawers banged and the closet door slammed. Then silence. The dog crawled from her hiding place, and 4 terrified youngsters began to relax and search for an explanation. We checked the room and found nothing out of place. The only window was closed and locked from the inside. That was the last manifestation of any kind from grandfather's room. Never again did we hear his voice. We don't know what caused the disturbance, but the 4 of us like to believe that grandfather found what he was looking for, and now has no more reason to return. That experience was from J.M. Swan, Pine Valley, New York, September 1967. Final flight. At 3 o'clock in the morning, after we buried my dad, Thomas Hogan, in Queens, New York, the front door slammed, and the large mirror over the sideboard in the dining room hit the floor. It did not break or shatter. For 15 years, Dad had slammed that door at 3 o'clock after a night out at his favorite tavern. My mother, Ruth Hogan, often scolded him, saying that one day the mirror would fall, but it never had until now. My grandfather, William O'Shea, and I were frightened, but nevertheless we started down the stairs. We stopped when we heard the door to the basement close and footsteps going down the stairs. Continuing on down, we saw the mirror. We went to the basement door, but could hear nothing. We locked the door and decided to wait until daylight for further action. After Mother's suicide by hanging the year before, on January 4th, 1948, Dad had chosen to sleep in the basement. He had also hanged himself there on June 18th, 1949, when he was 46 years old. The next morning, Grandfather and I continued our search, and though the strange pungent smell of death was present, we checked the 2 windows in the basement bedroom, and they were locked, and so was the one in the laundry area. We We looked at each other and decided to forget it. The same afternoon, I was out in the backyard with my son Kenneth when I heard something hitting those same bedroom windows. I was amazed to see a fairly large bird frantically trying to break through the glass from the inside. I called out to Grandpa, asking him to go down to the basement and unlock the back door. A few seconds later, after Grandpa had joined us in the garden, the bird flew out. It circled over our heads 3 times, then perched on the garden gate nearby, watching us. When I said, "You are free to go," the bird circled my head once more, then flew away. Life with Dad had not been easy. I had the strange feeling he was asking for forgiveness now that his spirit was going to another plane. That story was from Eleanor Page of St. Petersburg, Florida, January 1988. Still in the family. In the late 1970s, I belonged to an enthusiastic Southern California group known as PSI, or Psychic Science Investigators. There were between 15 and 20 of us. One of our activities was to visit old houses in the area and tune in on them psychically. I was in charge of these investigative tours. Among the historical sites we visited was Newland House in Huntington Beach. We went through it room by room to see what vibrations we could pick up on and keep mentally alert for any possible psychic phenomena. When our group went through the Newland House, I was careful to explain to the docents, volunteers who take visitors on tours of the historic residence, that we would like to walk through the building without being given any information about the rooms or anything in them. We also asked and received permission to use the psychic gift of psychometry, which meant we could touch or handle objects to gain psychic impressions from them. We did all of this and jotted down our impressions. After our exploration, we decided to meditate around the large dining room table. Sometimes in the altered state induced by meditation, it becomes easier to pick up thought forms or spirits who may be present. We had a video camera with us and used it to record the proceedings. At one point during our meditation, the chandelier over the table began to swing back and forth. We all saw this, and so did the Dawsons who were seated outside our circle. Yet when we played the videotape, the chandelier was not moving. As we continued to meditate, I could sense a spirit standing by my right shoulder. I could see her clairvoyantly, very clearly. The figure was that of an old woman wearing a long lavender dress. She had white hair done in a bun, and she was leaning on a cane. In my mind, I could hear her voice. In a querulous tone, she said she wanted me to ask a question to her. a question for her. My portrait is missing from this house, she said, and added, it was in a large, oval, dark-colored frame. I want it put back. So I interrupted the meditation and described the woman to the group. Then I described the portrait and asked if anyone there knew what had happened to it. Since no one seemed to know anything about the matter, the meditation resumed. When it was over, the spirit appeared again at my right side, and again she insisted I ask about her portrait. The old lady is back again, I said to everyone in the room, and I don't think she will go away until she gets an answer. Can anyone help? At this, one of the Dawsons, Bess Kennedy, who had accompanied us through the house, turned red and stammered, I have it. Everyone looked at her in surprise. I have it, she repeated, and then she confessed. Before I was married, my maiden name was Newland. The old lady you described to us was my grandmother. When Newland House was given to the county as a historical site, I wanted to have my grandmother's portrait, so I took it home with me. Yes, it looked exactly as it was described, but now it is in a square frame instead of the oval walnut frame it had been in originally. She looked at the other Dawsons and said firmly, I'm not giving it back. I told her she would have to work that out with her departed grandmother. At this point, the spirit disappeared. Maybe she was satisfied knowing her portrait was still in the family. That story was sent in by Christine Metzner from Fullerton, California, in January 1986. Okay, guys, that's all for today, but I will definitely record some more of these and maybe look through my other books too. I had been reading the Reddit stories that were, like copyright free, domain free. And I didn't think that I could read stories from books, but I don't know, I'm not monetized. And even if I was, I wouldn't monetize videos where I'm using other people's stories and not my own, so I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter, but if for some reason these videos disappear, I guess it's because it's copyrighted, I don't know, but any hoot. Okay.